They say that when you move into a new place, you're supposed to feel a sense of beginning, a fresh start. But the moment I turned the key in the lock of apartment 4B, all I felt was an inexplicable weight pressing down on my shoulders. It's a new building, one of those modern high-rises made of glass, steel, and hollow promises. Everything smells like fresh paint and sawdust, a clinical mask meant to hide the emptiness of the structure. My name is Anton. I'm a freelance graphic designer, which means I spend most of my time staring at screens and avoiding human interaction. That's why this place seemed perfect. The rent was suspiciously low for a new build, but the landlord, a greasy man named Mr. Volkov, assured me it was just a promotional rate to fill the building. The neighbors? I had asked him during the viewing. Volkov had waved a dismissive hand. A few eccentrics, maybe some crazies who think the walls are too thin or the shadows are too long. Don't mind them. You pay on time, you get peace and quiet. Peace. That was the lie I bought. The first few days were uneventful. I spent my time unpacking boxes, arranging my desk, and trying to ignore the way the hallway lights flickered with a rhythmic, pulsing hum. But on the fourth night, the silence of the building changed. It was roughly 3:15 a.m. I was lying in bed, drifting in that shallow ocean between wakefulness and sleep, when a sound vibrated through the floorboards. Scree, scree. It was a dry, rhythmic scratching, like a dog trying to dig through concrete, or long, unkempt fingernails dragging across the wood. It wasn't coming from the ceiling or the pipes. It was coming from right outside my bedroom door, no further back, the front door. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I stayed motionless, straining my ears. The sound stopped. I waited for 10 minutes, counting my breaths, convinced I had imagined it. Just as I prepared to lie back down, it returned, sharper, more deliberate. Scree ETCH. I threw off my covers, the cold air of the apartment biting at my skin. I grabbed a heavy metal flashlight from my nightstand and crept into the hallway. The shadows in the living room seemed to stretch toward me, elongated by the dim streetlights bleeding through the blinds. I reached the front door. I leaned my head against the cold metal surface. On the other side, I heard something wet, a soft, squelching sound, followed by a heavy, labored exhale. It sounded like someone was breathing through a throat filled with gravel. Holding my breath, I leaned forward and looked through the peephole. The hallway was bathed in the sickly yellow glow of the motion sensor lights. It was empty. The long, carpeted corridor stretched out toward the elevators, silent and sterile. No one was there. No doggy. No intruder. No crazy nego boy. Hello, I whispered, my voice cracking. No answer. I stood there for what felt like an hour, staring into the distorted fisheye lens of the peephole. Nothing moved. Eventually, exhaustion overrode my fear, and I dragged myself back to bed, blaming the new building jitters. The next morning, the sun felt like a protector. I headed out to the local grocery store to stock up on supplies. As I was returning, juggling 2 heavy paper bags and fumbling for my keys in the hallway, the door to 4C creaked open. An old woman stood there. She was small, hunched over like a withered branch, her skin a map of deep, translucent wrinkles. Her eyes were milky with cataracts, but she fixed them on me with terrifying intensity. Before I could say hello, she reached out and gripped my wrist. Her fingers were impossibly cold, like ice wrapped in parchment. "Listen to me, boy," she hissed, her voice a ragged tremor. "You're the new one in 4B. I saw you move in." Yes." "Hi, I'm Anton." I stammered, tried to pull back politely. She didn't let go. She leaned in closer, the scent of mothballs and sour milk washing over me. "Don't you ever open that door. Do you hear me? Never. Not unless you see them clearly with your own eyes through the glass. If the hallway is empty, stay inside. If the voice sounds familiar, stay inside. I don't understand, I said, finally wrenching my arm free. Mr. Volkov said there were some colorful neighbors, but Volkov is a liar or a fool, she spat. The door is a thin shield. Anton, the things that walk this hall at night don't want your money. They want an invitation. Remember, if the eye sees nothing, there is everything to fear. She retreated into her apartment and slammed the door, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the corridor. I stood there, my wrists still tingling from her grip. I remembered the scratching from the night before. I remembered the empty hallway in the peephole. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the cold dread pooling in my stomach. She's just a senile old woman, I told myself. Volkov warned me about the crazies. But as I stepped into my apartment and locked the 3 deadbolts, I couldn't help but notice the marks on the outside of my door. At the very bottom, near the floor, there were 3 deep, vertical grooves carved into the heavy oak. They looked exactly like claw marks. The encounter with the old woman in the hallway left a bitter taste in my mouth, one that no amount of morning sunlight could wash away. I spent the afternoon trying to work, but my eyes kept drifting toward the front door. The 3 claw marks at the base of the wood felt like a countdown I didn't understand. By 5 p.m., the silence of the apartment became suffocating. To drown out the phantom scratching in my mind, I decided to cook a real meal, something complex enough to demand my full attention. I set out my ingredients on the marble countertop: a thick cut of ribeye steak, cloves of garlic, fresh rosemary, and a bag of gold potatoes. I started with the potatoes, peeling them with methodical, rhythmic strokes. The sound of the blade against the skin was grounding. I boiled them until they were soft, then mashed them with heavy cream and a generous knob of butter until they were silky smooth. Next, I prepared the steak. I seasoned it heavily with sea salt and cracked black pepper, the abrasive grains stinging the small nicks on my fingertips. I heated the cast iron skillet until it began to smoke. The steak hit the pan with a violent, satisfying sear. The kitchen filled with the aroma of rendered fat and toasted spices. I tossed in the garlic and rosemary, basting the meat with foaming butter. For a moment, I felt like a normal person in a normal home. I wasn't a man being haunted by a doorway. I was just a guy making dinner. But as I plated the food, I realized I had forgotten to close the blinds. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the living room floor. The golden hour had turned into something gray and oppressive. The reflection of the kitchen lights against the window glass made it impossible to see the world outside. It was as if the apartment had become a lit stage and the rest of the world was a dark, expectant audience. Knock, knock, knock. I froze, the tongs still in my hand. It wasn't the scratching. It was a firm, human knock. 3 sharp raps against the wood. My heart skipped a beat. I set the plate down and walked slowly toward the door. The old woman's warning screamed in my head. If the eye sees nothing, there is everything to fear. I leaned in and pressed my eye to the peephole. The hallway light was on. Standing there was a man. He looked to be in his late 30s, wearing a casual flannel shirt and a friendly, if slightly tired, expression. He held a small plastic bag in one hand. He looked entirely, boringly human. "Hello," I called out, my voice slightly muffled by the door. "Hey, sorry to bother you," the man said. His voice was warm, a baritone that vibrated with genuine neighborly awkwardness. "I'm Mark from 4D, just down the hall. I was making some pasta and realized I'm completely out of salt. I saw your lights on and figured I'd try my luck before heading to the store." I hesitated. I looked through the peephole again. He wasn't hiding anything behind his back. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like a guy who just wanted to finish his dinner. "Hold on a second," I said. I unlocked the deadbolts. 1, 2, 3. The metallic clicks felt like a breach of contract. I opened the door just a few inches. "Hey man," Mark said, offering a small smile. "I'm the guy who moved in a year ago. Welcome to the asylum." "I'm Anton," I replied, feeling a wave of relief. Talking to a normal person made the old woman's warnings feel like the ramblings of a fever dream. "I actually just sat down for dinner. I've got plenty of salt. Come in, don't just stand in the hall." "Oh, I don't want to intrude on your meal," Mark said, though he stepped across the threshold as I widened the door. "Nonsense. I made way too much mash anyway," I said, gesturing toward the kitchen. "I'm tired of eating in silence." Mark stepped into the living room. He looked around with a curious, analytical gaze. "Nice setup. You've got a better view than I do. My place just looks out at the brick wall of the neighboring block." "It's okay until the sun goes down," I remarked, heading to the kitchen to grab another plate. "Then it just feels like someone's watching." Mark chuckled, but the sound was short and dry. "Yeah, you get used to that feeling in this building. It's the walls. They've got a way of holding on to things." I handed him a plate heaped with steak and potatoes. "What do you mean, holding on to things?" Mark took a bite of the steak, nodding in approval. "This is incredible, Anton. Seriously. As for the building, let's just say you aren't the first person to feel uneasy here. But hey, at least you've got a neighbor who isn't trying to hex you." We sat down at the small dining table. Outside, the last of the light vanished, leaving the windows as black as ink. Mark seemed perfectly at ease, but as he reached for his glass of water, I noticed something. His fingernails were ragged, not bitten, but worn down as if he had been scraping them against something very hard. "So, Mark," I said, try to ignore the sudden chill in the air, "what's the deal with the old woman in 4C? She tried to grab me today." Mark's expression darkened slightly. He set his fork down and leaned forward, the shadows from the overhead light making his eyes look like deep, hollow pits. "Ah, Mrs. Gable," he whispered. "She's a complicated case, but she's not the one you should be worried about." Mark chewed his steak slowly, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere behind me. The friendly, neighborly mask he had worn at the door was beginning to slip, replaced by a heavy, somber intensity. The kitchen, once filled with the warm aroma of butter and garlic, now felt cold. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, a sharp, buzzing sound that seemed to grow louder in the silence. "You asked about the building, Anton," Mark said, wiping his mouth with a napkin. He leaned back, his shadow stretching long across the living room wall. "And you asked about Mrs. Gable in 4C. She isn't crazy. She's just terrified. She's been here the longest. She saw what happened before the renovations." I put my fork down. My appetite had vanished. "What happened?" "The landlord told me this was a premium new build." Mark let out a short, bitter laugh. "Volkov is a salesman. He didn't tell you they built this place on the bones of an old tenement? They stripped the walls to the studs, but you can't strip away a curse with a coat of primer." He leaned forward again, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "About a year before you moved in, your apartment, 4B, wasn't a luxury suite. It was a hoarder's den. A woman lived here. Everyone called her the Bone Mother. She was a practitioner of things people don't talk about anymore. Not just cards and palm reading, but the old, dark stuff, blood and earth." I felt a prickle of sweat on my neck. "A witch. A desperate one," Mark corrected. "The building management tried to evict her because she had turned the place into a literal pigsty. Dirt on the floors, jars of unidentifiable things on the shelves, the smell of rotting meat wafting into the hall. When the bailiffs finally broke the door down, she wasn't there. But the walls were covered in symbols painted in something that wasn't paint." He took a long sip of water, his eyes never leaving mine. As they dragged her belongings into the street, she stood on the sidewalk and screamed a curse. She said that since she was being cast out into the cold, the house would never again know the warmth of a soul. She promised that she would leave a sentry behind, something to ensure that anyone who slept in her bed would eventually belong to her. "That's just a story, Mark," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. "I thought about the 3 claw marks on the door." "Is it?" Mark asked, tilting his head. "Since then, 3 tenants have lived in 4B. The first disappeared. The second threw himself off the balcony. The third, well, I haven't seen the third one in a month. And then there's the scratching. You've heard it, haven't you?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. Mrs. Gable thinks that if you don't look at it, it can't find a way in. She thinks the peephole is a window for the soul. If you see the sentry, it sees you. And once that connection is made, the door is just a piece of wood. Mark suddenly stood up, the chair screeching against the floor. The sound made me jump. "Anyway," he said, his tone suddenly light again, "I've talked your ear off. My wife is probably wondering where I am with that salt. Thanks for the dinner, Anton. It's been a long time since I had a meal that wasn't cold." I walked him to the door, my heart pounding. I wanted him to leave, yet the thought of being alone in the apartment was suddenly terrifying. "See you around, neighbor," Mark said, stepping into the hall. He turned back for a split second, his face caught in the dim light of the corridor. "And remember what the old woman said. If you don't see anything in the glass, don't turn the lock." I watched him walk down the hall toward 4D. I closed the door and turned all 3 deadbolts. Click, click, click. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood. Was Mark telling the truth? Or was he just another eccentric neighbor trying to scare the new guy? I looked through the peephole one last time. The hallway was empty. Mark was gone. I went to the kitchen to clean the dishes, but I couldn't stop looking at the floor. I kept imagining the bone mother sitting in the corner of my kitchen, scratching at the boards. I finished the dishes and went to the living room to turn off the lights. As I reached for the switch, I glanced at the dinner table. There were 2 plates. Mine was half full. Mark's plate was scraped completely clean. But then I looked at his glass. I had poured him water. The glass was still full to the brim. Not a single drop had been touched. And then I saw the chair where he had been sitting. On the pristine, light-colored fabric of the seat, there was a smudge of something black and oily. It looked like soot or ash. A cold realization washed over me. Mark had eaten the meat, but he hadn't touched the water. And he had talked about his wife, but I hadn't heard a single sound come from apartment 4D since I moved in. I backed away into my bedroom, locking that door too. I crawled under the covers, clutching the flashlight. I tried to convince myself that I was overreacting. But as the clock ticked toward 3 a.m., the silence was broken. Thump! It wasn't a scratch this time. It was a heavy, deliberate blow against the front door. Thump! It sounded like a sledgehammer hitting the wood. My eyes flew open. I looked at the bedroom door. Thump! The sentry was back, and it wasn't scratching anymore. It wanted in. The clock on my nightstand glowed a rhythmic, neon green. 3:12 a.m. The apartment was a tomb of shadows, the air so still it felt like it had turned to ice. Then came the sound that shattered the silence. A blow so violent that the floorboards beneath my bed groaned in sympathy. Boom! It wasn't a knock. It was a declaration of war. I sat bolt upright, my skin crawling with a primal, electric terror. My breath came in short, jagged gasps, puffing out in white plumes of mist. The temperature had plummeted. It felt like the very heart of the building had died, leaving only the cold vacuum of the void. Boom! I forced myself out of bed. My legs felt like lead, heavy and uncooperative. I gripped the heavy flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to be a target. I crept through the dark living room, my eyes fixed on the front door. The heavy oak was vibrating. Dust shaken from the ceiling drifted down like gray snow in the pale moonlight. Thump! 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 The rhythm was getting faster, more desperate. I remembered Mrs. Gable's frozen, icy grip. I remembered the soot on the chair. My hand trembled as I reached for the peephole, my fingers hovering over the cold metal. If the eye sees nothing, there is everything to fear. I pressed my eye against the glass. The hallway light was flickering, a dying strobe that revealed the world in jagged, disconnected frames. At first, I saw nothing but the empty carpet. But as the light flashed again, a figure materialized directly in front of my door. It was not human. It was a blasphemy of flesh and shadow. Standing over 7 feet tall, the creature was a skeletal nightmare. Its body was entirely, unervingly black. Not the black of skin, but the black of a forest after a fire. It looked like a man who had been burned alive. His skin turned to cracked, obsidian charcoal. Long, jagged horns erupted from its brow, curving back like the crown of a forgotten subterranean king. It had no eyes. Where they should have been were 2 bottomless, hollow pits that seemed to suck the light out of the hallway. It stood perfectly still, its long, spindly arms hanging at its sides, its fingers ending in scorched, needle-sharp points. Slowly, agonizingly, the creature's jaw began to drop. It didn't stop where a human jaw would. It unhinged, stretching down until its throat was a gaping, dark abyss. Inside, I saw rows of teeth, not white, but stained a deep, oily black, sharp as broken glass. Then, the creature smiled. It was a wide, impossible grin that stretched from ear to ear, splitting the charred skin of its face. It didn't have eyes, but it knew I was there. It was looking right through the door, right into my soul. It leaned forward until its hollow sockets pressed against the other side of the peephole. SCETCH. It slammed its palms against the door and dragged its claws down the wood with a screech that set my teeth on edge. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of metal on bone. It began to beat against the door with a frenzied, inhuman strength. Bang, 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 bang. I recoiled, falling backward onto the hardwood floor. I scrambled away on my hands and knees, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would burst through my chest. "Go away!" I screamed, my voice cracking into a sob. "Leave me alone." The banging reached a fever pitch, a rhythmic assault that felt like it was going to tear the door off its hinges. The walls around the frame began to crack, the plaster splintering like bone. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise. It was absolute. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, listening to the thundering pulse in my ears. I waited. 5 minutes passed. 10. The cold in the room began to lift, the mist of my breath vanishing. I crawled back toward the door, my hand shaking so much I could barely lift the flashlight. I needed to know. I needed to see if it was still standing there, waiting. I reached up and peeked through the hole one more time. The hallway was empty. The flickering light had stabilized into a steady, sterile glow. There was no charred king, no horns, no hollow eyes. My phone was on the kitchen counter. I lunged for it, my fingers fumbling as I dialed 911. "Emergency services, what is your location?" a calm, female voice asked. 42nd Street, New Horizon Apartments, room 4B. I whispered, my eyes locked on the door. "There's something outside my door. It's trying to get in. Please, send someone now." "Stay on the line, sir. Officers are dispatched. They'll be there in 15 minutes. Are you in a secure room?" I think so," I said, sliding down the wall. Just as the operator started to give me instructions on how to barricade the door, a new sound drifted through the wood. It wasn't a bang. It wasn't a scratch. It was a voice. A human voice. "Anton? Anton, are you there? It's Mark." My blood turned to ice. "Anton, please open up." Mark's voice was high, frantic, and layered with a raw, jagged terror. I saw her. I saw Mrs. Gable. Oh God, she's dead, Anton. She's pinned to the wall in the hallway. There's something in the building. Please, let me in before it comes back. I looked at the door. Was it Mark? Or was it the thing with the charred skin, using his voice like a lure? I looked at the peephole. If I saw him, I had to let him in. If I didn't, Anton, please. I can hear it coming up the stairs. I stood up, my hand on the lock. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to stay back, but the sound of a man dying on the other side of that door was a weight I couldn't carry. The voice on the other end of the phone was a thin, tinny thread of reality in a world that had gone completely dark. Sir, are you still there? The officers are 6 minutes out. Do not open your door for any reason. But the operator didn't hear what I heard. She wasn't in this hallway of shadows. Anton, for the love of God, open the door. Mark's voice was a jagged shriek of pure, unadulterated panic. I'm looking right at her, Mrs. Gable. She's stuck to the ceiling like a broken doll. It's coming back, Anton. I can hear the scratching. My hand hovered over the deadbolt. My mind was a battlefield. Mrs. Gable's warning, if the voice sounds familiar, stay inside, clashed with the raw, human impulse to save a neighbor from a grisly death. If that thing I saw was real, and if it was truly out there hunting, I couldn't let Mark be torn apart while I watched through a tiny glass hole. Anton, please. I lunged for the peephole. I had to see. I had to be sure. I pressed my eye to the lens. The hallway was bathed in a pulsing, rhythmic red light. The emergency strobes must have triggered. In the crimson flashes, I saw him. Mark was slumped against my doorframe, his face a mask of sweat and terror. His flannel shirt was torn at the shoulder, and his hand was stained with something dark. Behind him, the corridor seemed to stretch into infinity, the shadows dancing in the red light. I didn't see the Charred King. I only saw a man who was about to die. I'm opening it. Get ready to run in. I shouted. Sir, do not open that door. The operator screamed through the phone, but I dropped the device on the floor. Click, click, click. I threw the door open. Mark didn't just walk in. He fell into the room, stumbling over his own feet as he scrambled past me. I slammed the door shut and threw the bolts back into place with a frantic strength I didn't know I possessed. We both collapsed against the door, panting, our chests heaving in the dark. Did you see it? I gasped, the adrenaline making my vision blur. Mark didn't answer immediately. He was curled in a ball on the floor, his head between his knees. He was shaking, vibrating so hard I could hear his teeth chattering. Slowly, he looked up. His eyes were wide, the pupils dilated until there was almost no color left in his irises. It wasn't a man, Anton, Mark whispered, his voice cracking. I went out to check the noise, and I saw the old woman. She was pinned to the wall by her own shadow. And then I saw it. It was 10 feet tall, and it looked like it was made of burnt wood. It didn't have a face, just a hole. I felt a wave of cold nausea. The Sentry, the Bone Mother's curse. We have to get out of here, Mark said, grabbing my arm. His grip was frantic, his fingernails digging into my skin. We can't stay in this room. The door won't hold. I heard it laughing. The police are coming. I told him, pointing the phone on the floor. 5 more minutes. We just have to hold out for 5 more minutes. Boom. The entire apartment shook. A massive blow struck the center of the door, right between our heads. We both scrambled back, retreating into the living room as the wood began to splinter. Boom! Boom! The sound was different now. It wasn't just a hit. It was a rhythmic, calculated tearing. We could hear the screech of claws against the oak, the sound of the Sentry literally peeling the door apart. The kitchen. I yelled, "Get a weapon. Anything." We ran into the dark kitchen. I grabbed a heavy, serrated bread knife from the block, my hands slick with sweat. Mark grabbed a wooden broom, snapping the head off to create a makeshift jagged steak. We stood behind the kitchen island, staring at the hallway that led to the front door. The apartment felt like it was shrinking. The walls seemed to lean in, the ceiling lowering like a lid on a coffin. For minutes, I whispered, checking my watch. Suddenly, the banging stopped. The silence returned, heavy and suffocating. We stood there in the dark, our hearts thundering in unison. Then a soft, wet sound started. Slurp, slurp, drip. Something was leaking through the cracks in the door. A black, oily liquid began to pool on the hardwood floor, spreading toward us like an ink stain. Anton, Mark whispered, his voice trembling. Look at the window. I turned my head. We were on the 7th floor. Outside the glass, in the absolute darkness of the night, a pair of long, charred fingers was gripping the windowsill. One by one, more fingers appeared. The sentry wasn't just at the door. It was climbing the building. There's nowhere to go, Mark sobbed, raising the broken broom handle. It's everywhere. The glass of the window began to spiderweb, a slow, agonizing crackling sound filling the room. 3 minutes, I breathed, raising the knife. Just 3 more minutes. The spiderweb cracks on the window glass were the only thing moving in the room, growing with a sound like breaking bones. The black liquid from the front door had reached the edge of the kitchen tiles, beginning to sizzle as if it were eating through the very floorboards. 2 minutes, I choked out, my knuckles white as I gripped the bread knife. The police, they have to be in the lobby by now. They won't be fast enough, Mark whispered. He wasn't looking at the window anymore. He was staring at the front door. The heavy oak didn't just break, it exploded inward. The deadbolts were ripped from the frame like staples from paper. Through the sudden cloud of splinters and dust, a single, massive, charred hand gripped the door frame. The fingers were long, far too long, and as they gripped the wood, it turned to charcoal beneath them. Then it stepped in. It had to crouch to enter, its curved horns scraping the ceiling, leaving deep, blackened grooves in the plaster. It was 3 meters tall, a towering monument of burnt meat and shadow. The smell of a house, fire, and rotting lilies filled the apartment, thick enough to gag on. Its empty eye sockets were fixed on us, and that impossible, teeth-filled grin widened until the skin on its cheeks began to tear. Mark let out a primal scream, a mixture of pure adrenaline and absolute, soul-crushing terror. He lunged forward, swinging the jagged broom handle with every ounce of strength he had left. "Stay back," he shrieked. The blow landed squarely on the creature's chest. It should have snapped. It should have done something. But the wood simply vanished into the creature's charred skin as if it had been dipped in lava. The sentry didn't even flinch. With a movement so fast, it was a blur, the creature's hand snapped out and caught Mark by the throat. The sound was sickening, the crunch of a windpipe, the snap of a collarbone. Mark's feet left the floor. He kicked frantically, his face turning a deep, bruised purple. "Mark!" I screamed, lunging forward with the knife. I stabbed at the creature's arm, but it felt like hitting solid stone. The sentry turned its head toward me, and for a second, the world went silent. It opened its mouth, not to scream, but to feed. Its jaw unhinged further than I thought possible, and as it leaned toward the struggling Mark, the creature's face began to ripple. Beneath the charred skin, faces began to form. Like trapped souls trying to push through a sheet of rubber, I saw the distorted, screaming face of Mrs. Gable. I saw the face of the Bowen mother. And then, as the sentry's teeth closed around the middle of Mark's torso, I saw Mark's own face manifest on the creature's neck, his eyes rolling back in a silent, eternal agony. A single, wet crunch echoed through the kitchen. The sentry bit him in half. The upper portion of Mark's body fell to the floor with a heavy, wet thud. The creature didn't stop. It began to chew, the sound of grinding bone filling the room. I was paralyzed. I backed away toward the balcony window, the bread knife falling from my useless fingers. I reached the glass, my back against the cold surface. We were on the 7th floor. A leap would be suicide, but staying was a fate far worse than death. The creature turned toward me, its mouth dripping with a mixture of Mark's blood and that black, oily soot. It began to crawl across the floor on all fours, its movements insect-like and twitchy. "Please," I sobbed, my hand fumbling for the window latch. "Please, no." Just as the creature lunged, its massive hand reaching for my face, the front door area erupted in light. "Police!" "Drop the weapon." "Hands in the air." Flashlight beams cut through the darkness, blinding me. I heard the thunder of heavy boots on the floor. I saw the red and blue strobes reflecting off the hallway walls. "Save me," I yelled, shielding my eyes. "It's here. It killed him. Get on the ground. Now." I felt hands grabbing me, throwing me to the floor. I felt the cold bite of steel handcuffs on my wrists. I was screaming, pointing at the center of the kitchen where the monster stood. But as the officers' lights flooded the room, the screaming stopped. The Sentry was gone. The kitchen was bright, sterile, and horrific. There was blood everywhere. It was on the walls, the ceiling, and my own clothes. And in the center of the floor lay the two halves of Mark. Epilogue: the window in the ward. The defendant is a clear danger to himself and the public. The prosecutor's voice was a distant drone. I sat in the mahogany-walled courtroom, my hands still shaking in their restraints. They showed the photos. Mrs. Gable, found in 4C, strangled and beaten. Mark from 4D, practically torn apart by blunt force and a jagged tool. They found the bread knife. They found my fingerprints on the broom handle. They told the jury that this soot on the chair was actually just ash from my own fireplace that I had tracked around in a dissociative state. They said I was a loner with a psychotic break brought on by the stress of the move. I didn't kill them, I whispered to the judge. It was the Sentry. It has their faces now. It's in the building. The judge didn't even look up. Anton Vasilyev, you are hereby committed to the State's Psychiatric Institute for the criminally insane, pending further evaluation. Now, I sit in a room with padded walls and a single, reinforced window. It's a beautiful view of the grounds, but I never look at it during the day. I only wait for the night, because every night, when the moon is thin and the hallway lights of the ward begin to flicker, I hear it. Scree-tch. Something is scratching at the heavy steel door of my cell. And when I look through the small, rectangular observation slit, I don't see the orderlies. I don't see the hallway. I see a pair of hollow, charred eye sockets. I see a jaw that unhinges into an abyss. And I see Mark's face, etched into the creature's throat, looking at me with a jagged, toothless grin. I know who killed them, and I know that as long as I can see him, the door is just a suggestion. I look out the window into the night, and in the reflection of the glass, I see the silhouette of the charred king standing right behind me. He's smiling, and this time, I've already let him in.